Good Saturday morning to you. This is Pastor Mark Pierce from Church Requel, and I'm here for Bible study number 114 for this Saturday morning, April the 25th. Well, I hope that this is capturing. I had to do a bit of a climb up the hill from the bike trail to be able to get to this particular location, but it's another beautiful scene and is a great setting for the topic that I'd like to speak to you about today, which is Hillel and Shammai. We want to talk about two rabbis by the name of Hillel and Shammai. Now you might say, why do we want to talk about rabbis? I thought we were doing a Bible study through Matthew chapter 5. Well, we are. Remember, earlier this week I told you how important it is for you to have an understanding of the culture and the history. Well, we've taken a lot of time this week, right, to look at the Roman background, the Greek background, the Hebrew background. But there's some history here that I think is fascinating. And if you know it, you'll never look at this particular passage in the same way again. I want to talk to you about two rabbis who lived about 100 years before Jesus and their particular influence on the discussion on Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. So again, just in honor of the word, let's take our Bible and turn to Matthew chapter 5, verses 31 and 32. We've looked at it now for 8 days, so you probably have it memorized by now. Jesus is speaking and he says, "It was also said, whoever divorces his wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce. But I say to you that everyone who divorces his wife, except on the ground of sexual immorality, makes her commit adultery. And whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery." Now, when we usually think of rabbis, let's face it, today, especially if you've grown up in the Christian church, you're thinking of one rabbi and one rabbi only, and that is Jesus. After all, Mary Magdalene, on the day of resurrection, Easter, called him Rabboni, which in Aramaic means teacher. That according to John chapter 20, verse 16. Jesus was certainly the greatest rabbi or teacher, and he was much more than a rabbi and a teacher, but he certainly was not the first rabbi. It was common for great Jewish teachers, otherwise known as rabbis, to have a following of students, otherwise known as disciples, and together with their students and disciples, they would sit down and they would discuss, they would contemplate, and they would think about the Torah, the law, what you and I might know as the Old Testament. What did it mean? How do we live it out? And there were two rabbis before Jesus that had very different views on how to interpret the Torah. The first that we want to talk about today is Rabbi Hillel. He led a school that was very broad-minded, very generous. He was known for looking at the Torah as a living document. He would ask the question, well, what did God have in mind when he gave the Torah? What was his intention? How might it apply to our situation today? He was very much concerned with the heart of Torah as well as with the heart of God. Now, on the other side of this fence, on the other side of the debate, was another rabbi by the name of Shammai. Rabbi Shammai led a school that took a very literal, a very wooden interpretation of the Torah. If God said it, well, there was no interpretation. We simply had to do it. His school was known to be very strict, very severe, and very austere. If you want to know what God's intention is today, Rabbi Shammai would say, well, just read the Torah, and it'll tell you. Now, why do we need to know this? Well, let's fast forward to the Sermon on the Mount, to the end of the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapter 7, verses 28 and 29. What do you see there? We read that when Jesus finished these sayings, the crowd was astonished at his teaching, for he was teaching them as one who had authority, not as one of their scribes. You see, the way of teaching that was common in Jesus' day was that Rabbi Hillel says this, or Rabbi Shammai says that. But Jesus, he simply said, well, you've heard it said, but I tell you. In other words, Jesus had an authority that was all his own. Now remember this, when we're looking at these 6 different situations of how to interpret the Torah, remember there's 6, right? We've looked at 2, we're looking at the 3rd one right now on divorce, and we have 3 more to go. The first 2 on anger and on lust, Jesus took a very Hillel-like approach, right? Jesus says, hey, you've heard it said that you should not murder, but I say, look at your heart, right? The heart is you shouldn't even be angry. Or you've heard it said that you should not commit adultery, but I say, look at your heart. If your heart is lusting after someone, you've already committed adultery. That would be a very Hillel-like point of view. So his listeners by this point in time surely knew this, and by the time they got to this issue of divorce, they thought perhaps that since Jesus had taken this Hillel-like viewpoint before, that he would do it again. Again, Hillel saying it's not necessarily the strictest interpretation, it's looking at the heart of the matter. But when we get to this issue of the divorce, Jesus, and by the way, also when we get to the issue of oaths, how do you like this? An airplane flies overhead just as I'm getting to this crux of the matter. Oh, God has great timing. When Jesus gets to this idea of divorce and the issue of oaths, he takes a very strict interpretation of the Torah. It's a very Shammai-like way. In other words, you cannot take Jesus and put him in a corner. You can't say he's like Hillel. You can't say he's like Shammai. And later on, when we get to the issues of retaliation and loving your enemy, Jesus truly goes where no man has gone before. So what's the conclusion on this Saturday morning? I want you to let the words of the Sermon on the Mount just fill your soul, just wash over your being. I know it's common today to say, hey, no one could possibly live up to the expectations that Jesus gives us in the Sermon on the Mount. Well, no one could by themselves, but they can with the Spirit of God. Will you continue to think about this over this weekend and say, Lord, help me to live out life the way you have intended for me to do. I can't do it alone. I need your help. We won't have a Bible study tomorrow morning on Sunday because we'll be doing a sermon, so look for it here. Otherwise, we'll come back with the Bible study on Monday morning. I hope that wherever you are, that you'll be in church on Sunday. Thanks for joining me, and have a great weekend.